Okay, so today this video is going to focus particularly on the APPIC application. So the application itself, the actual information that you enter in, not necessarily the materials, that stuff is covered in a different video. Part of why I wanted to go through this is I know that for me personally, when I was applying, I think it wasn't until I actually opened the application that I had any idea what information is asked for. I think I had a general sense. Obviously, we kind of know, I think ahead of time, like, they're going to ask about hours and things like that. But I think there's a lot of specific questions that are helpful to look at and to be able to see ahead of time what type of information you'll be asked for, particularly so that you can start looking for this information if you need to or preparing. So I am going to show, basically this is my application. I have de-identified it just so that it's the focus is on the questions, obviously, and not necessarily what my answers were. And I will say that obviously this application is from 2019. So meaning I matched in 2019. Yeah. So you can see that obviously it starts with a lot of the information that you would expect. So certainly contact information. You will get an APPIC code number when you register for APPIC. It does ask about citizenship, as well as demographic information. Hopefully at this time they've updated this to say pronouns, sort of preferred pronouns. Whether or not you have any licenses, and then it does ask a few questions about how many articles you have published, books, and presentations. Then you move into the professional conduct category. So this is where it's asking about disciplinary action or probationary action. So for each of these questions, you answer yes or no. And if you do answer yes, you can give an explanation. I believe that with this, when I've read through applications, I think that you have quite a bit of space, maybe even unlimited space, to be able to explain information and to give your kind of side of things and your story about things. I think that with this too, there are some questions on here where perhaps if you are answering yes, you might want one of your letter writers or your DCT to give some explanation, particularly if they think that they can, if you think that they can give kind of a story about how maybe you had been put on some form of probationary period for your program and how they really saw growth over time. I think that that's really what a lot of internship sites are looking for. They want to see that there was a change over time. They do ask about legal background as well, and they do ask you to elaborate. I think that you can elaborate to the point that you feel comfortable. You do give information about previous colleges that you have attended. So this is where you're giving information about previous graduate institutions as well as undergraduate institutions. As I say in a different video, you will be sending transcripts. I don't think that you send transcripts for your undergraduate degree. Don't quote me on that though. I really do need to look into that. But you're mostly just giving information about what the program was, your GPA, and what the degree was that you were awarded with that program. And then you are also talking about your current program, so that you are seeking a PhD or a PsyD, if you have any specialization, etc. Does ask about whether it's accredited. Of course, we know too that within the match now, you do have to be from an accredited program in order to match with an accredited internship site. This was in response to the so-called internship crisis of a few years past, where there was an oversaturation of people coming from programs and not enough internship sites, and that was part of how they managed that. You will also answer your dissertation topic and whether or not, what status you are at, whether you're, at some point it will ask whether or not you've collected data yet, and you will provide information and contact information for your doctoral or dissertation advisor. So then we move into some aspects about your doctoral program. So this is where it's asking whether or not you've completed academic coursework. For many people, the answer is no, but that's why they ask about the date expected. So the answer may be that it is expected that you will complete that coursework in May of the current academic year, which obviously would denote that you'd be prepared to go on internship. You can see that for each of these questions, it's also asking whether or not this is required to participate in the match. So this means whether or not your program has required that you complete this milestone in the program prior to submitting your application. Most programs do require that you complete your comps, for example, prior to participating in the match. And then whether or not it's required to attend an internship as well. You can see here that it also asks questions about your dissertation. So whether or not you've had your proposal approved, you've started collecting data, whether you've analyzed data, and whether you've defended. And then again, it's asking you when it was completed or the expected completion date. Some of this is for them to find out whether or not you will be completing your dissertation prior to starting internship or not. Then we start moving into hours verification. So there are several different places where it's going to ask you for hours, and it is going to ask you to break them down into different categories. So this first one is really asking about your doctoral hours versus your terminal master's hours in 3 different categories. So it wants to know intervention hours, not including assessment. And then obviously your assessment hours are separate. And then how many hours of supervision you have received in both of those as well. So you do want to be distinguishing between the hours that you accrued during your doctoral program as opposed to a terminal master's. I think lots of people will give different opinions about this. I do think that your terminal master's hours, for many places, they do count these towards your total completed hours. This is something that they are looking at. And you don't want this to be overly skewed necessarily. So if you have let's say 600 intervention hours, but 400 of them or 450 of them came from your master's program and only 150 or 200 came from your doctoral program, that might be when programs are starting to look at things or to ask questions about things, because the majority of your hours were accrued as a master's clinician instead. Again, it's more about the ratio, and particularly it's about the ratio if your number of doctoral hours is relatively low. If instead you have a huge number of doctoral hours, so 800, 900, 1,000 plus intervention doctoral hours, and you also have 600 intervention hours from your master's program, I think that that's a little bit different, or that's something that there's going to be considered slightly differently. It does ask how many hours you anticipate accruing prior to starting internship. So this is asking about hours accrued after the November 1st, typically deadline. And then you will describe what those hours will be. So this is where you would talk about, I'm currently placed with a community mental health center and accruing an average of 10 direct hours per week, 2 hours of supervision per week, and whatever indirect hours. And so you want to be able to give them a good estimate of what you expect to accrue. You will provide information about your DCT on site, or your training director on site. Your DCT actually does get sent the hours. So actually, before you submit your final application, there's a time period where you should be submitting your hours application to the DCT. They will verify the hours, and then they also typically write something similar to a letter of recommendation or a reference letter, where they talk about your experience in the program. They talk about whether or not you're in academic good standing. This would be also where they address any previous disciplinary action or probationary periods. So then we move into a different form of breaking down the hours. So this is where we're talking a little bit more about the type of therapy that you were providing. Again, you can see that there's a section over here for what you've provided in your doctoral program versus your master's program, and that you're going to be talking about the total number of hours as well as the total number of individuals that you saw. So you'll kind of break these down into these different categories, how many hours you have across each of these, and how many different clients you saw in these different categories. I think that you want to be able to answer as close to the accurate answer as possible for the number of different individuals. I do think that this can be relatively difficult sometimes. For example, working in residential treatment centers, often when I was seeing individual clients who were adults, I saw them in group therapy. I saw them in family therapy or couples therapy. So I was really seeing them in a lot of different modalities, and trying to count and keep track of who is a unique identifier can be more difficult. Of course, this is where time to track, if you are using time to track or some form of tracking system, that can be really helpful. Then you move into where it talks about other psychological experience with students and or organizations. So you're talking about whether or not you've done supervision of other students, whether you've done program development or outreach, some of those more unique kind of experiences that don't necessarily fall into the more typical clinical services. And I believe you can actually provide comments down here about what those experiences were. When we get to the testing experience, again, obviously it's broken down by doctoral versus master's. I really wasn't an assessment person, so I can't say a whole lot about this. But some of what it talks about is it does ask you how many integrated reports you have written for adults versus children and adolescents. It asks about how many times that you've given tests or testing feedback in your doctoral or your master's program. And then it actually asks an additional question for adult assessments, and you can see down here for child assessments as well. I did not work with children, but it will ask you to name the different assessments that you've given. So you actually do want to give a list of every single assessment that you've provided. I believe it has a drop-down list for the most part for a lot of the main or common ones. But of course, I think that you can write in your own. I think that I wrote in my own. And for each one, then you want to talk about how many of them you've clinically administered, how many clinical reports you wrote that included this, and how many of that were administered as part of a research project. So certainly they know that you're not always necessarily providing these assessments for clients, but you still might have that experience as part of a research study. And you'll do the same thing for child assessment instruments as well. I think certainly for people who have done a lot of assessment, this section is going to take a while. You're really going to have to dig into the specifics, and you do want to break it down pretty specifically, especially if you were looking for sites where assessment is going to be particularly valued. Then we move into supervision received. So again, you want to be able to address how many hours of supervision you received from licensed psychologists in individual settings versus group settings, versus allied mental health professionals or others, which would include, advanced graduate students who are supervised by a licensed psychologist. Then you have yes or no questions about whether or not you've had clients reviewed with a supervisor for audio tape, videotape, and live observation. It is a requirement of APA at this point that for our programs, you do have to have some form of observation by a supervisor each semester. So the answer to at least one of these three questions should be yes. Hopefully you have yes in a few different categories, although naturally that depends on the sites that you are at. And then the last section here, before we move into kind of demographic stuff, is really just asking about support activities. Really, this is the indirect hours question. So how many indirect hours do you have? And then it asks you to describe what some of those support activities might have been. I mean, I think that there's many of the things that I have listed here are the ones that I would expect most applicants would be listing as well. All right, so then we move into additional information about the practicum experience. Like I said, there's gonna be a lot of different places where you answer questions about hours in different formats. So, you know, in this one, it is talking about how many of your hours came from different types of placements. You want to be giving how many of those intervention hours came from that placement, how many came from, how many assessment hours came from that placement as well. It does ask if you've led or co-led any type of groups. And then I think that the question, even though I know that it doesn't say it here, I believe what was asked was if you could describe, this is optional, I believe, but if you could describe the name of the group, how many or how long the groups ran, and with how many clients. I found this question to be somewhat difficult. As you can see from my answers here, I ran a lot of groups that just repeated multiple times over and over and over again. I'm like, I have no idea how many clients I saw in some of these. Some of them I probably saw, 15, 20 clients at a time rotating. I think especially when we're talking about groups that are open, hard to track how many. And so you can see that I talked about averages here, trying to, again, be relatively close to the actual number. And I think that it's difficult to be exact on this one. And then it asks the question about your theoretical orientation. So it really asks you to rate. I think you're up to your top 3 theoretical orientations that you use. I think that I listed 2 different ones as other, and then specified which one was number 1 versus which one was number 2. I mean, personally, I think it's interesting. I don't know that I would agree with what I probably wrote at that time. I think that my orientation has changed quite significantly, even in the last couple of years. All right, now we get into demographic numbers. Again, I thought that this was a pretty challenging part of the application, and I actually am a person where I had pretty detailed notes about my client information. This is something that I tracked throughout my program. I was fortunate that this was something that we were told about early on in the program. However, I think that one of the things that I was not told or did not realize as early as I wish that I had was I was tracking demographic information for individual clients, but I was not tracking information for group clients initially. And I had to go back and kind of get that information. Again, like I said, I was in placements where I saw some of the same clients in individual, group, family, et cetera. And so trying to keep track of who's a new, unique client versus who is not. And especially in groups that are so large, very difficult. Again, time to track really helps with this. I think that one of the other main challenges here is that, the racial groups that they list are not necessarily the way that I would describe race. Some of them are dated or inaccurate. Same thing for sexual orientation. And I believe, and gender, quote, gender, the way that they have it described here. And so I think that can make it somewhat difficult. I think especially for folks who are able to see this list prior to getting too far into the program, I think that this is really helpful because you can start tracking this information in a way that will be kind of on track with what the application looks like. I'm sure the application will change periodically over the next few years, but at least you'll have a kind of a basis for what this looks like. So again, you can see the breakdown here asking, and I did round. I tried to use approximations. I had a good sense of the answer, but some of my categories just did not line up with what is listed here. And so it was a lot more difficult. I actually did not track disabilities. really at all, I don't think. And so because of that, like you can see that I don't really have those categories listed. I think that this part of the application is optional. You don't have to necessarily provide, I think, any of the answers, but I think that you probably want to. I think that particularly for some sites, maybe more than others, they are very interested to see kind of the differences that you've seen, or if you've been able to really, specialize in specific groups. That is something that you might want to highlight. And then the last question here is about non-practicum clinical work experience. So this really just asks you what experiences you had working with clinical populations that were not kind of in the capacity as a trainee. So certainly for people who are licensed with a master's clinician license and are seeing clients or have seen clients, this is where they would be able to address that. I also talked about experiences that I had working as, like residential counselors or similar, para experiences. And I talked about kind of specifically who that population was, when it was in my life, and what that looked like. And then that's it. You sign and obviously date this. And then that's when we start getting into the additional or supplemental materials that go into the application as well. So a lot of stuff that is covered in this application, a lot of different information that you have to be able to kind of put in various ways. But hopefully seeing it ahead of time makes it a little bit easier to start sorting out the hours that you have and how you want to address certain things.